John Parker stood at attention in the military airport overseas. His Royal Guard uniform was perfect, not a wrinkle or spot to be seen. His face showed no emotion, but inside, his heart was heavy. He had been given an important job, one of the hardest jobs a soldier could have. John was 32 years old and had served for 12 years. He had seen many difficult things in his time as a soldier. But today's task was different. Today, he would escort Private Thomas Wilson home for the last time. Thomas was only 23 when he died, a young soldier with a bright smile and big dreams. John had not known Thomas well, but he knew that Thomas had been brave. Thomas had died saving 3 other soldiers when their vehicle hit a hidden bomb. The wooden box in front of John was simple. It was covered with the country's flag, red, white, and blue cloth draped perfectly over the edges. Inside that box was Thomas's body, ready to make the long journey home. "Guard Parker," said Captain Reynolds, walking up to John. "The plane leaves in 3 hours. The paperwork is done. Are you prepared for this duty?" "Yes, sir," John replied, his voice steady. "I understand the responsibility." Captain Reynolds nodded. "Private Wilson's mother called again this morning. She's very worried about her son's journey home." John thought about Thomas's mother. He had spoken to her on the phone yesterday. Her voice had been shaking as she asked him to please take good care of her only child. "I promised her I would bring him home safely, sir," John said, "and I will keep that promise." "I know you will," Captain Reynolds said, putting his hand on John's shoulder for just a moment. "This is your first escort duty, isn't it?" "Yes, sir, but I understand what needs to be done." The captain handed John a folder with tickets and documents. "Commercial flight. First to London, then the connection to Chicago. Wilson's family will meet you there." John took the folder. "I won't let him out of my sight, sir." After the captain left, John sat on a bench near Thomas's flag-covered coffin. He had 3 hours before they would load the coffin onto a truck and drive to the civilian airport. 3 hours to sit with a young man he barely knew but now felt deeply connected to. "I'll get you home, Thomas," John said quietly. "Your mother is waiting." John remembered meeting Thomas only twice, once during a training exercise where Thomas had impressed everyone with his quick thinking. The second time was at a base celebration, where Thomas had talked excitedly about his girlfriend back home and how he was saving money to buy her a ring. Now John carried a small box in his pocket. Inside was the ring Thomas had finally bought, but never got the chance to give. John would deliver this to Thomas's girlfriend too. As the hours passed, John thought about the journey ahead. It would be long, almost 20 hours of travel. He would need to stay alert the whole time. He would need to make sure Thomas was treated with respect every step of the way. What John didn't know was that the hardest part of the journey wouldn't be the long hours or the weight of his duty. It would be something he never expected to face at the airport, something that would test his dedication to his fallen brother in arms. As the time approached to leave, 2 soldiers came to help load the coffin into the transport vehicle. "Ready, Guard Parker," one of them asked. John stood up straight and nodded. "Ready. Let's take our brother home." The drive to the civilian airport was quiet. John sat in the back of the transport truck next to Thomas's flag-covered coffin. Every bump in the road made John reach out to steady the coffin, as if protecting Thomas from one more hurt. When they arrived at the airport, John stepped out first. He stood tall in his Royal Guard uniform as airport workers came with a special cart. "Please be careful," John said as they moved Thomas's coffin onto the cart. The workers nodded, seeing the seriousness in John's eyes. Inside the busy airport, people rushed in all directions. But when they saw John walking behind the cart with the flag-covered coffin, many stopped and stepped aside. Some people put their hands over their hearts. One old man in a veteran's cap gave a slow, respectful salute. At the airline check-in desk, John handed over his folder of documents. "I need to check in for the flight to London," he said. "I'm escorting a fallen soldier home." The woman at the desk looked at the coffin, then at her computer screen. Her fingers stopped typing. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, lowering her voice. "I don't see any cargo booking for the deceased." John shook his head. "Private Wilson is not cargo. He is a fallen soldier being escorted home with dignity. I have all the proper documents here." The woman looked uncomfortable as she called her manager. More people gathered around, watching quietly. A man in a dark suit came quickly. "I'm the duty manager. What seems to be the problem?" John explained again, keeping his voice calm even though he felt anger rising inside. "I am Royal Guard John Parker, escorting Private Thomas Wilson home to his family. I have all the required documents." The manager took the papers and looked through them with a frown. "These seem to be in order, but there's an issue with how this was booked. The coffin will need to go as checked luggage in the cargo hold." John felt his back stiffen. "That is not acceptable. Private Wilson died serving his country. He will travel with honor, not as luggage." The manager sighed. "I understand this is a sensitive situation, but airline policy is clear. The coffin must travel in the cargo section." By now, a small crowd had gathered. People were watching with concern, some whispering to each other. John noticed a woman recording with her phone. "Private Wilson is under my protection," John said, his voice getting stronger. "I promised his mother I would bring him home safely and with dignity. I will not break that promise." The manager looked around nervously at the growing crowd. "Sir, I'm just following company policy. Perhaps if you had booked a private charter." "This isn't about money," John interrupted. "This is about respect. Private Wilson gave his life for his country. The least we can do is bring him home with honor." An older woman stepped forward from the crowd. She was small but spoke with a strong voice. "My son serves too," she said to the manager. "If that were my boy, I'd want him treated with respect." Others in the crowd began to nod and murmur in agreement. The manager looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Let me make some calls," he said finally, stepping away with his phone. John stood at attention next to Thomas's coffin, not moving an inch. He would stand there all day if needed. The minutes ticked by slowly. Some people from the crowd came up to express their support, each one making John stand a little taller. What should have been a simple check-in had become a standoff. John knew this was just the beginning of their journey home, but he was determined. He had made a promise, and Royal Guards kept their promises, no matter what stood in their way. The manager returned, his face serious. John prepared himself for more resistance, not knowing that things were about to take an unexpected turn. The manager returned with a woman in a pilot's uniform. She had gray hair pulled back tightly and kind eyes that had seen many things. "I'm Captain Sarah Reynolds," she said, extending her hand to John. "I'll be flying the plane to London today." John shook her hand firmly. "Royal Guard John Parker, ma'am. I'm escorting Private Thomas Wilson home." Captain Reynolds looked at the flag-covered coffin, then back at John. "My brother served for 20 years. I understand what this means." She turned to the manager. "The airline has a policy for fallen soldiers that seems to have been overlooked. Private Wilson will travel in the cabin, not as cargo." The manager started to object, but Captain Reynolds held up her hand. "This is not a discussion. It's happening." Relief washed over John's face, though he kept his posture perfect. "Thank you, Captain." "We'll need to make some arrangements," she said. "The flight is full, but we'll find a solution." Captain Reynolds spoke quietly with her crew. Soon, the gate agent made an announcement over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a fallen soldier traveling home today. We're looking for volunteers who would be willing to take a later flight to make room for him and his escort." John was surprised when hands went up immediately. Not just one or two, but dozens of people volunteered. An elderly couple approached the desk first. "We'll wait for the next flight," the man said. "Our grandson is in the military too." More people came forward. Soon, there were enough volunteers to clear the last row of seats on the plane. The airline staff seemed moved by this show of respect. "See," Captain Reynolds said to the manager, "this is how we handle it. While they waited to board, a young airport worker approached John shyly. "Sir," he said, "my brother is overseas right now. Can I bring you and Private Wilson some water or coffee?" John thanked him. Water would be appreciated. The young man returned with bottles of water and something else, a small American flag pin, which he pressed into John's hand. "For your journey," he said simply. When it was time to board, Captain Reynolds made sure John and Private Wilson went first. 4 airline staff members carefully carried the coffin on board and secured it across the last row of seats. John sat directly across from it. As other passengers boarded, many stopped to pay their respects. Some touched the flag gently. Others whispered thank you as they passed. One young girl placed a small drawing on top of the flag, a child's simple picture of an angel. Her mother tried to take it back, but John shook his head. "It's okay," he said softly. "I think Thomas would like it." Before takeoff, Captain Reynolds came on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the honor of helping a hero return home. Royal Guard John Parker is escorting Private Thomas Wilson, who gave his life in service to his country. Please join me in a moment of silence to honor Private Wilson's sacrifice." The plane fell completely quiet. Even the small children seemed to understand the importance of the moment. When the silence ended, an old man in the front row began to sing softly. It was a patriotic song about homeland and sacrifice. Slowly, others joined in. The simple melody filled the cabin as the plane taxied toward the runway. John sat straight in his seat, eyes forward. But inside, he felt something powerful happening. What had started as a battle with airport rules had turned into something much more meaningful. As the plane lifted into the air, John looked out the window at the country Thomas had died protecting. The first part of their journey home had been difficult, but they were on their way. And John knew now that he and Thomas were not traveling alone. What he didn't know was that an even greater challenge awaited them at their connection in London. The flight to London was long. John did not sleep. He sat alert, watching over Thomas as he had promised. When the plane landed, Captain Reynolds herself came to speak with John. "A special team will help transfer Private Wilson to your connecting flight," she explained. "They should be waiting for us." John nodded. "Thank you for everything, Captain." As passengers left the plane, many nodded respectfully to John or touched the flag on Thomas's coffin one last time. John remained seated until everyone was gone. When they finally stepped off the plane, John was surprised. On the tarmac stood a line of British soldiers in full uniform. They snapped to attention as Thomas's coffin was carefully removed from the plane. An older officer stepped forward. "Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, British Army. We're here to help with your transfer. Guard Parker." John saluted. "Thank you, sir. I wasn't expecting this." "Word travels fast among those who serve," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said. "We have 2 hours before your connecting flight. We've arranged a quiet room for you and Private Wilson." The British soldiers formed an honor guard, walking alongside Thomas's coffin as airport workers transported it carefully across the tarmac. People stopped to watch the procession. Some put their hands over their hearts. Others stood silently with bowed heads. In a quiet room away from the busy terminal, John finally had a moment to rest. A young soldier brought him a hot meal and fresh coffee. "Will you be all right alone, sir?" the young soldier asked. "I can stay if you need anything." "Thank you, I'm fine," John replied. When the soldier left, John sat beside Thomas's coffin. For the first time since beginning this journey, he allowed himself to feel tired. "We're halfway home, Thomas," John said quietly. "Your mom will be waiting for us in Chicago. And Sarah, too." Sarah was Thomas's girlfriend. John had spoken to her on the phone before leaving. She had cried when John told her about the ring Thomas had bought for her. John reached into his pocket and took out the small velvet box. He opened it to look at the simple diamond ring inside. Thomas had saved for months to buy it. "You picked a good one, Thomas," John said, closing the box and putting it back in his pocket. "She's still waiting for you to come home." After an hour of quiet reflection, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison returned. "It's time to prepare for your next flight," he said. "But there's a small problem." John felt himself tense up. "What kind of problem, sir?" "The Chicago flight is overbooked. The airline is trying to figure out seating arrangements for Private Wilson." John stood up straight. "Private Wilson will not travel as cargo." "I understand completely," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said. "That's why I've already spoken to the airline's regional director. They've agreed to handle this properly, but there's still a question of space." John nodded. "I'll stand the whole way if I have to." A small smile appeared on the lieutenant colonel's face. "That won't be necessary. Come with me." They walked through the terminal to the gate where passengers were already lining up to board the flight to Chicago. The gate agent was making an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the honor of transporting a fallen soldier home to his family. If you are seated in first class and would be willing to give up your seat to allow the soldier to travel with dignity, please come to the desk." John watched in amazement as people stepped forward immediately. Not just one or two, but every single first-class passenger volunteered. An elderly businessman was first in line. "My son serves," he said simply. A well-dressed woman behind him nodded. "Take my seat too." One by one, they gave up their seats, not for refunds or better flights, but out of respect for a soldier they had never met. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison turned to John. "Sometimes, Guard Parker, people surprise you in the best possible ways." What John didn't know was that word of their journey had spread even further, and something even more remarkable awaited them in Chicago. The flight to Chicago was different from the first one. This time, Thomas's coffin was placed in the first-class section, with John sitting beside it. The flight crew treated them with special care, speaking softly, and making sure John had everything he needed. "Would you like to tell me about him?" a flight attendant named Mary asked during a quiet moment. John looked at her, surprised by the question. No one had asked about Thomas the person yet, only about the procedures for transporting him. "He was a good soldier," John said, "always ready to help others. That's how he—" John's voice trailed off. Mary nodded understandingly. "You don't have to say more." But John found that he wanted to talk about Thomas now. He loved baseball, the Chicago Cubs. He always said he'd see a game at Wrigley Field when he got home. Mary smiled sadly. "My brother is a Cubs fan too." Thomas had a great laugh. John continued. You could hear it across the base, and he was saving up to propose to his girlfriend, Sarah. Talking about Thomas made the long flight pass more quickly. John shared stories about the young soldier's life, and for the first time in days, he found himself smiling at the memories. Halfway through the flight, the captain made an announcement that made John sit up straight. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Chicago Air Traffic Control has just informed us that we have been given a special priority landing clearance in honor of Private Wilson. We will be arriving 20 minutes ahead of schedule." The passengers applauded quietly. An older man across the aisle leaned toward John. "My grandson is overseas right now," he said. "Thank you for bringing this young man home with such care." As they began their descent into Chicago, John looked out the window. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. 2 fire trucks were positioned on the tarmac, their water cannons ready. When the plane taxied past them, the trucks shot powerful streams of water into the air, creating an arch for the plane to pass under. This water salute, normally reserved for retiring pilots or special occasions, was being given for Thomas. But that wasn't all. As they came to a stop, John could see through the window that the tarmac was lined with people. There were soldiers in uniform, airport workers, and others standing at attention. "We've been asked to let you deplane first," Mary told John quietly. "There's a reception committee waiting." When the door opened, John stood at attention. 4 airline staff members carefully removed Thomas's flag-draped coffin from the plane. John followed, stepping into the bright Chicago sunlight. The sight that greeted him was overwhelming. Hundreds of people stood in perfect silence. There were soldiers, police officers, firefighters, and veterans. Many wore uniforms with medals showing their own service. A military band played softly as Thomas was carefully moved to a special transport vehicle. John walked behind, his back straight and his eyes forward, though he felt tears threatening to form. At the end of the line stood a middle-aged woman with Thomas's eyes and a young woman holding a photo of Thomas in his uniform. Thomas's mother and Sarah had come to meet them. As John approached, Thomas's mother stepped forward. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Instead, she reached out and took John's hand in both of hers, holding it tightly. Behind her, Sarah watched with tears streaming down her face as Thomas's coffin was loaded into the hearse. She had been waiting for Thomas to come home for so long. This wasn't the homecoming she had imagined. John swallowed hard. Soon he would need to give Sarah the ring and tell her how much Thomas had loved her. But first, they needed to complete this final journey together. What John didn't know was that the entire city seemed to be aware of their arrival, and the most emotional part of their journey was just beginning. As they left the airport, John saw that police motorcycles were waiting. The officers nodded respectfully at John, then took positions in front of and behind the hearse carrying Thomas. "They're giving us a police escort to the funeral home," explained an airport official. Thomas's mother, Helen, invited John to ride with her and Sarah in the car behind the hearse. As they pulled away from the airport, John noticed something strange. Cars were pulling over to the side of the road. People were getting out of their vehicles and standing with their hands over their hearts. "What's happening?" John asked quietly. "Word spread on the local news and social media," Sarah explained, her voice shaking slightly. "People have been waiting for hours." John looked out the window in amazement. It wasn't just a few people. The entire route was lined with citizens paying their respects. Some held signs thanking Thomas for his service. Others waved small flags. Many were crying. At one intersection, a group of school children stood with their teachers, each child holding a handmade sign with messages like "Thank you" and "Hero" written in bright colors. Thomas would have been so embarrassed by all this attention. Helen said with a sad smile. "He never liked being the center of attention." "He deserves it," John said firmly. "He saved 3 other soldiers that day." Sarah looked up, her eyes wide. "He did. We weren't told exactly what happened." John nodded. "Their vehicle hit a roadside bomb. Thomas pulled 3 men to safety before." He couldn't finish the sentence. Helen reached over and squeezed John's hand. "Thank you for telling us. It helps to know he died saving others." As they drove, John noticed more and more people lining the streets. In one neighborhood, every house had an American flag on display. Outside a fire station, firefighters stood at attention in full uniform, saluting as the procession passed. "I've never seen anything like this," John said softly. "Thomas grew up here," Helen explained. "Everyone knew him. He played baseball at the high school. He delivered newspapers when he was younger. This community raised him." At a busy intersection, John was surprised to see a large group of veterans from different eras standing together. Men and women who had served in World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan stood side by side, united in their respect for a fallen brother. The procession slowed as they passed the high school where Thomas had graduated just 5 years earlier. The entire student body stood outside in silence. The baseball team was in front, each player holding their cap over their heart. "Coach Miller," Helen said, pointing to an older man standing with the team. He never missed one of Thomas's games. As they neared the funeral home, John saw that the crowd had grown even larger. People were packed tightly along both sides of the street. They weren't cheering or making noise. They were standing in respectful silence. "I knew my son was loved," Helen said, tears streaming down her face, "but I never realized just how much." When they finally arrived at the funeral home, an honor guard was waiting to carry Thomas inside. John stepped out of the car and stood at attention as the local soldiers carefully moved Thomas's flag-draped coffin from the hearse. "Guard Parker," a local military officer said, approaching John. We can take over from here, if you'd like to rest. John shook his head. Thank you, sir, but I promise to see this through to the end. As they prepared to carry Thomas inside, John noticed something unusual. A tall man with a weathered face was making his way through the crowd. He walked with a slight limp and wore a military medal on his jacket. John didn't know it yet, but this man's arrival was about to change everything. The man with the limp made his way through the crowd until he stood directly in front of John. Up close, John could see that he was in his early 30s, with a scar running along his left cheek. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, his voice breaking slightly. "Are you the one who brought Thomas home?" John nodded. "Royal Guard John Parker." "Sergeant Mike Daniels," the man replied, offering his hand. "I was there when it happened. Thomas saved my life." A hush fell over the nearby crowd. Helen and Sarah moved closer, their eyes wide with surprise. "You're one of the three?" John asked quietly. Mike nodded. "Thomas pulled me out first. I was closest to the door when the bomb hit. He went back for the others, even though the vehicle was on fire." He turned to Helen. "Mrs. Wilson, your son is the bravest man I've ever known." Helen couldn't speak. She simply reached out and embraced Mike, holding him tightly as they both cried. Sarah stood nearby, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "The doctors said I wouldn't make it out of the field hospital," Mike continued when Helen finally released him. "I had too many injuries, but I made a promise to Thomas in those last moments. I promised I would make it home to tell you what he did." Mike reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "He asked me to give you this if he didn't make it." Helen took the paper with trembling hands but didn't open it. "Thank you," she whispered. "I only got out of the hospital last week," Mike explained. "When I heard Thomas was coming home today, I knew I had to be here." The local military officer approached again. "It's time," he said gently. The honor guard lifted Thomas's coffin and began to carry it up the steps of the funeral home. John walked beside them, his back straight and his eyes forward, just as he had done throughout the entire journey. Inside, the funeral home was quiet and peaceful. Thomas's coffin was placed carefully on a stand at the front of a large room filled with flowers. When everyone else stepped back, John remained at attention beside Thomas. Helen approached John slowly. "You've done so much already," she said. "You've brought my son home. You can rest now." John shook his head. "I'd like to stand the first watch, Mom, if that's all right with you." She nodded, understanding the military tradition of never leaving a fallen soldier alone. As the room began to fill with people coming to pay their respects, John remained at his post. He stood perfectly still, honoring Thomas with his presence and his silence. After an hour, Mike Daniels approached. "I'll take the next watch," he offered, "so you can rest." John looked at the man Thomas had saved. "Thank you." As John stepped away from his position, he saw Sarah sitting alone in the front row. He remembered the ring in his pocket, the one Thomas had bought but never had the chance to give her. John walked over and sat beside her. "Sarah," he said gently, "Thomas asked me to bring something home for you." He took out the small velvet box and placed it in her hands. Sarah stared at it, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "He bought it the week before." John's voice trailed off. "He wanted to give it to you himself when he came home." Sarah's hands shook as she opened the box and saw the diamond ring inside. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she slipped the ring onto her finger. "It fits perfectly," she whispered. What John didn't know was that Sarah had a secret of her own, something she had been waiting to tell Thomas when he came home. A secret that would make tomorrow's funeral even more heartbreaking. That evening, John found himself sitting in the Wilsons' living room. Helen had insisted he come home with them instead of staying at a hotel. "You brought my son home," she had said. "Your family now." The house was filled with photos of Thomas as a smiling baby, a little boy in a baseball uniform, a proud teenager in his graduation cap, and finally, a serious young man in his military uniform. John sat quietly, looking at a photo album Helen had placed in his hands. Each page showed another moment from Thomas's life. He always wanted to serve, Helen explained. His father was a soldier too. We lost him 10 years ago in another war. John looked up, surprised. I didn't know. Helen nodded. Like father, like son, both heroes. From the kitchen, Sarah brought in coffee and sat beside Helen on the couch. The engagement ring sparkled on her finger. She hadn't taken it off since John gave it to her. There's something I need to tell you both, Sarah said softly. I was waiting to tell Thomas when he came home, but now. She took a deep breath. Helen reached for Sarah's hand, seeming to know what was coming. I'm going to have a baby, Sarah said. Thomas's baby. I found out just after he left for his last deployment. I wanted to surprise him when he came home. John felt his heart tighten in his chest. Thomas would never meet his child. A baby, Helen whispered, tears filling her eyes again. But this time, there was a small smile on her face too. A part of Thomas will live on. Sarah nodded. It's a boy. I'm going to name him Thomas. The room fell quiet as they all thought about this new life that would carry on Thomas's name. Outside, neighbors and friends continued to drop off food and flowers on the porch. Later that night, after Sarah had gone home to rest, John sat with Helen at the kitchen table. She finally opened the letter Mike had given her. Would you like me to leave you alone? John asked. Helen shook her head. Please stay. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper and began to read aloud. Dear Mom, if you're reading this, I didn't make it home. I'm sorry. Please don't be sad for too long. I did what I needed to do, and I didn't hesitate. Dad always told me that's what makes a good soldier, not hesitating when others need help. I hope I made you both proud. Tell Sarah I love her more than anything. I was planning to ask her to marry me when I got home. The ring is with my things. And Mom, I need you to do something for me. The guys in my unit, they're my brothers. Please check on them when they come home. Some of them don't have family like I do. They'll need someone to make them cookies and ask about their day. I had a good life, even if it was shorter than we hoped. I wouldn't change anything. All my love, Thomas. Helen folded the letter carefully and held it against her heart. That's my boy, she whispered. John sat in respectful silence, deeply moved by Thomas's words. In that moment, he felt he truly knew the young man he had been escorting home. The next morning would bring the funeral, a full military service with honors. It would be John's last official duty in bringing Thomas home. But as he sat in the Wilson family kitchen, he knew this wasn't just an assignment anymore. He had made a promise to bring Thomas home with dignity and respect. Now he understood that home wasn't just a place on a map. It was here, with the people who loved Thomas most. The next day would test John's strength in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The morning of the funeral was clear and bright. John put on his formal Royal Guard uniform, making sure every button shone and every crease was perfect. Today would be his final duty to Thomas. The church was already full when they arrived. People stood outside because there was no room left inside. John walked beside the coffin as it was carried into the church by 6 soldiers, including Mike Daniels. Helen and Sarah sat in the front row. Sarah wore a simple black dress with Thomas's ring clearly visible on her hand. She rested her other hand gently on her stomach where their baby was growing. The service was both sad and beautiful. Thomas's baseball coach spoke about his determination. His childhood friends told funny stories that made people laugh through their tears. Mike Daniels talked about Thomas's bravery on that final day. When it was time for the military honors outside, John stood perfectly straight as the flag on Thomas's coffin was carefully folded. The officer in charge handed the folded flag to John with a small nod. This was John's final duty, to present the flag to Thomas's mother. He walked slowly to where Helen sat and knelt in front of her. On behalf of a grateful nation, John said, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt, I present you with this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your son's honorable and faithful service." Helen took the flag with trembling hands and held it close to her heart. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and touched John's cheek gently, like a mother would. "Thank you for bringing my boy home," she whispered. As the honor guard fired the 21-gun salute and a bugler played taps, John stood at attention one last time for Thomas. The sound of the bugle seemed to float across the cemetery, touching everyone's heart. After the service, people gathered at the Wilson home. The house and yard were filled with Thomas's friends, neighbors, fellow soldiers, and even people who had only known him briefly. They all came to show their respect and share memories. John watched from a quiet corner, his duty now complete. Tomorrow he would fly back to his base. As he was thinking about leaving, Sarah approached him. "John," she said softly, "I want you to know something. When my son is old enough, I'm going to tell him how you brought his father home with such care and respect. You're part of our story now." Before John could respond, Helen joined them. "And you'll always have a place here," she added. "Thomas would want you to stay connected to us." John felt a mix of emotions he hadn't expected when he first accepted this assignment. What had begun as a duty had become something much more personal. Later that evening, as the house grew quiet, John went outside to get some fresh air. He looked up at the stars and thought about everything that had happened since he first stood next to Thomas's coffin days ago. He thought about the airport worker who tried to stop him, not understanding the importance of his duty. He thought about the kind captain who helped clear the way. He remembered the passengers who gave up their seats, the strangers who lined the streets, and the school children with their handmade signs. Most of all, he thought about the promise he had made to bring Thomas home with dignity and respect. It had not been an easy journey, but with the help of many people along the way, he had kept that promise. As John prepared to leave the next day, Helen handed him a small package. "Something to remember us by," she said. Inside was a framed photo of Thomas in his uniform, smiling broadly at the camera. On the back, Helen had written, "Thank you for bringing our hero home. You will always be family." John knew then that though his duty was complete, his connection to Thomas and his family would last forever.